Have you ever noticed how guilt has the strength of a silent poison? It's not a scream, it's not a slap. It's a weight he carries deep in his soul, hidden from everyone like a shadow that no one else can see. He believed for a long time that hiding it was the only way out. Not speaking, not showing, not letting it show, but silence doesn't heal. Silence festers. And the more he kept quiet, the more his own mind became a prison. Have you ever felt this? That tightness in your chest that comes without an apparent reason, yet is, deep down, a reflection of something unresolved. He felt it, and not just once. It was repeated, constant, an invisible presence but noticeable in every gesture. The guilt he carried wasn't ordinary. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a mark that burned inside, as if moving forward was impossible without paying the price. And this perception distorted everything around him, the way he looked at himself, how he viewed others, how he believed, or didn't, that he deserved to be loved. If you read carefully, you might realize that this story doesn't just speak of him. It might also speak of you. Because guilt doesn't choose whom to hurt. It just settles in, it seeps in, it grows. At its core, the question is simple. How many times have you pretended to be okay while something inside was screaming that you weren't? How many times did you smile to hide the weight you were carrying? This is where everything begins. In the realization that living with hidden pain doesn't mean overcoming it. And today something changes. Today, what was hidden is revealed. Guilt can no longer hide. The truth begins to burn, and what seemed solid, beliefs, certainties, judgments, starts to crumble in the fire of revelation. Revelation doesn't come like a loud thunderbolt. It arrives like a discreet flame, almost imperceptible at first. But you know a small flame, when fed, can ignite everything. He realized this. At first, he resisted. He tried to keep the walls up, believing he could contain the truth. But the truth does not accept being contained. It hurts while suffocated. It burns silently until the moment it becomes impossible to ignore. And when that moment arrived, something inside him broke. It wasn't just pain, it was liberation. Because even though the revelation hurts, there is a profound relief in no longer having to sustain a lie. Do you understand that? Have you ever been through a moment when hiding was more painful than exposing? The body reacts, the heart races, the hands tremble, and the mind, once so used to carrying the secret, begins to open up to the possibility of no longer needing to hide. It's frightening, it's vulnerable, but it's real. And when guilt comes to light, it loses some of its power. It no longer rules with the same authority because it is no longer invisible. What was buried now breathes, and when it breathes, it transforms. At this point, perception becomes crucial. He was not just a man who erred. He was not just someone who failed. He was human, and behind the guilt, there was also pain, regret, and a desire to make things right. But guilt blinds. It makes one believe that nothing can be rebuilt. It convinces that the mistake defines the essence. Have you ever believed that? Have you ever found yourself trapped by a mistake, as if everything you are reduces to it? If so, comment, "I needed to hear this," because this realization can change destinies. And now, at this point where the revelation starts to burn, there is no turning back. The flame grows. What was secret expands. And everything that once held the old beliefs about right, wrong, deserving, forgiveness, begins to dissolve like ashes in the wind. When the flame of revelation grows, it doesn't ask if you're ready. It simply consumes. And in front of the fire, there's no mask that can withstand. Everything that was illusion begins to dissolve. He felt the ground opening up. The certainties that were once solid started to shatter like glass, and each shard reflected a part of himself he had tried to hide. The reflection was painful, but also inevitable, because the truth, when it emerges, doesn't just come to destroy. It comes to reveal what has always been there. And in that moment he realized something he had never dared to admit. The guilt that consumed him was not just about what he did, but about what he never had the courage to feel, to say, to face. Guilt is not limited to a mistake. It feeds on silence. It strengthens in fear. And it grows when you believe you don't deserve forgiveness. But there's a secret here. Forgiveness is not just given by others. Forgiveness is born when you have the courage to look at yourself in the mirror and say, "I made a mistake, but I am not just my mistake." He had never done that. That's why the guilt grew so much. That's why it took the form of an internal prison. And only now, when the fire of revelation burns, can he feel the possibility of something different. Have you ever looked at yourself with that kind of harshness? Have you ever believed that your identity was the sum of your failures, rather than what also flourishes within you? If so, then you understand the prison in which he lived. And now, in this fire that burns without asking for permission, there is a choice. He can hide again, try to extinguish the flame, rebuild the walls, or he can stand before it, allowing it to burn down to the roots, to what seemed impossible to uproot. The hardest part is that this choice doesn't happen just once. It happens every day, every morning, every memory that tries to come back and imprison him. It's a process of realizing, accepting, choosing again, and in this process something begins to be born. It's not hope yet. It's just space, a space that didn't exist before because guilt occupied everything. And this space, no matter how small, is already a sign of transformation. This space, which seemed so small at first, began to expand like a crack in the rock. There was no explosion. There was no spectacle, just the realization that something inside him was no longer trapped. And when there is space, air enters. Breath starts to circulate again. The heart, which once beat like a heavy drum of condemnation, now finds moments of silence. It is in this silence that new voices can be heard. Not the voices of accusation, but the voices of truth. He realized that guilt was never the only presence within him. There was also a desire to change. There was also genuine regret, which was not a sign of weakness but of sensitivity. And there was something deeper, a spark of life that never extinguished, even when he thought he was dead inside. This discovery did not come from the outside. It was not someone who brought it. It was not a miraculous word that healed. It was the direct contact with the flame of revelation that opened his vision. It was the shock of realizing that hiding did not protect him. It only killed him slowly. How many times have you believed that remaining silent was the best choice? How many times have you swallowed your scream thinking it would be easier to endure alone? If these questions resonate with you, it's because the same space that opened up in him can also open in you. Interestingly, at first, he did not trust this space. It felt too fragile. It seemed illusory, but over time he realized it was real. It was evident in small things, in a less heavy gaze, in a less tense breath, in a less racing heart. It wasn't complete liberation. It was just the beginning. But the beginning was already everything. And then a new revelation emerged. Guilt does not disappear suddenly. It weakens as it is exposed. Each time he spoke, each time he faced what he had avoided, each time he let the light penetrate the space that had once been occupied by darkness. This is the secret of transformation. It's not the absence of guilt, but the decision not to let it take control. And in light of this realization, he began to rise from a place that had previously been only about falling. The revelation not only changes what happens inside him, it also changes what happens outside. Because when someone stops living in hiding, everything around them transforms. He noticed this in the eyes of others. Before, there was always an invisible weight, distrust, distance, that feeling that something was out of place. Even when no one knew the secret, everyone sensed the shadow. It was like a bitter scent that unintentionally escaped. But now, with the flame ignited, the gaze had shifted. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't immediate forgiveness. It was impact. The kind of impact that occurs when someone lays themselves bare before the truth and no longer tries to control how others react. Some people distanced themselves. Others drew closer. But deep down, the revelation wasn't meant to please anyone. It was necessary for him to truly exist. And in this process, he began to understand something he had never considered. Others were not judges of his guilt, but mirrors of his own perception. When he hid, they reflected distance. When he revealed himself, they reflected truth, even if it was harsh, even if it was painful. Have you ever experienced this? Have you realized that the way you see yourself directly influences how the world responds to you? If so, then you already know what he felt in that moment when he decided to stop running away. The reactions of others were unpredictable, but the reaction inside him was clear. He could no longer go back to being who he was before. And here is the turning point. When the truth is exposed, it cannot be erased, it can be rejected, it can be ignored, but it can never be erased. And that fact alone began to liberate him even more from the grip of guilt. Because finally he realized the weight he carried was never just about the mistake itself. It was through the prison of believing that he needed to hide forever. And now, even though the world might not understand, he did. And that changed everything. The rebuilding didn't start with big steps. There were no immediate achievements, just small movements, almost imperceptible, but too profound to be ignored. He woke up differently, not because the guilt had disappeared, but because it no longer controlled all of his thoughts. It was as if he had found a space in the cracks where he could breathe without being crushed. In that space, life began to return. First in simple details, the way he felt the wind on his face, how silence stopped being a threat and became a refuge. Then in larger movements, the courage to make eye contact, the audacity to speak without apologizing for every word. And something became clear. The revelation was not just about the past, it was about the present. About the courage to exist without bending under the invisible weight. About realizing that each moment offered the chance for a new choice. He still remembered what he had done. The memory didn't vanish, but the memory ceased to be a tormentor. It became a teacher, and for the first time he didn't want to erase what happened. He wanted to learn from it. He wanted to transform the pain into awareness. Have you ever experienced that turning point, when what was once just a wound starts to become a lesson? If so, you know there's nothing more powerful than realizing that even guilt can be recycled into wisdom. This realization didn't come easily. There was resistance, there were nights of heavy silence. There were tears swallowed in the dark. But each time he fell, the flame of revelation reminded him, there's no going back. What has been seen cannot be forgotten. And that's how he began to walk differently. Not as someone who denied what he had done, but as someone who acknowledged it and still chose to move forward. This is the secret to rebuilding. Not to erase the past, but to leave it standing as proof that the fall was not the end. And little by little, the world began to respond, not with applause, not with absolution, but with respect. Because nothing is more noticeable than the strength of someone who has decided to no longer hide. Rebuilding requires more than just putting up new walls. It requires looking at the foundation. And that's when he discovered something even deeper than guilt. The root that fed everything he had lived through. It wasn't just the mistake. It wasn't just the wrong choice. It was the belief that he would never be enough. It was the sense of inadequacy he had carried for as long as he could remember, as if he had been born marked by something he couldn't explain. Guilt found in this fertile ground the perfect space to grow. Because those who already believe they do not deserve love easily, accept living condemned, and this realization hit him like a shock. He realized that the true prison did not begin with the mistake made, but much earlier. It began with the voices he once believed, voices that said, "You're not good enough. You don't deserve it. You always ruin everything." These voices became the soil where guilt took root. And now in front of the fire of revelation, he could no longer ignore where all that pain came from. It was painful to admit, because facing the mistake is difficult, but facing one's own distorted identity is much more so. However, only this way could the flame truly burn, not just the dry leaves on the surface, but the trunk, the root, the lie that sustained it all. Have you ever realized how sometimes the pain we carry today did not arise from what we are experiencing now, but from something much older? If this makes sense to you, write down below, yes, because this recognition could be the start of a healing that goes beyond appearances. He cried upon realizing, not out of weakness but out of liberation, because understanding the root is like finding the key to a prison that seemed eternal. And the key had been there all along, not outside, not in the hands of others, but within himself. In the realization that guilt did not define who he was, it merely reflected the distorted beliefs he had carried throughout his life. And for the first time, he dared to ask himself, if I am not just my mistake, then who am I really? This question ignited a new fire, an even more intense fire, because it's not enough to free oneself from guilt. It's necessary to discover what lies beyond it. The question echoed within him like a silent thunder. If I am not just my guilt, who am I really? This was the point at which revelation transformed from mere pain to a path forward. Because when you start to question who you are beyond your flaws, you discover a new, vast, daunting, yet liberating territory. He realized he no longer needed to define himself by the weight of the past. He no longer needed to live as a prisoner of a mistake. The flame that burned now did not destroy, it purified. It transformed memories into lessons, wounds into marks of resilience, falls into fertile ground for new beginnings. And in this process, he found something he had never felt before: dignity. Not the fragile dignity that depends on others' opinions, but the quiet dignity of someone who faces their own truth and chooses to stand tall. Can you feel the power of that? The power to choose to exist without hiding? The power to recognize your own vulnerability and still say, "I carry on"? That is the flame no one can extinguish. He did not emerge unscathed. No one does. But he came out more whole than he entered. Because deep down, true victory is not in never falling, but in getting back up while carrying the fire of revelation within yourself. And this is where his story intersects with yours. Because if you've read this far, it's because something inside you also knows what it's like to carry invisible burdens. It also knows what it's like to pretend to be okay, while the soul silently screams. And maybe, right at this moment, that flame is igniting in you as well. Don't ignore it. Don't run away. Allow it to burn away what no longer serves you, to reveal what you've always tried to hide. Because when the revelation happens, there's no turning back. And that's a good thing. It's at this point that life begins anew. So I need to ask you, what will you do with this flame that is now touching your heart? Will you smother it again, pretending nothing has changed? Or will you let it grow until it burns away the lies, the guilt, the shadows you've been carrying for so long? If this message has truly touched you, comment, "I needed to hear this," and share it with someone you know who is also living in hiding, carrying burdens that were never meant to imprison them forever. Because this is just the beginning. The fire has already been ignited, and in the next step, I want to show you not only how to deal with guilt, but how to transform every mark of it into vibrant strength for what is to come. This conversation doesn't end here. Click on the next video. What's coming next will not just stir you, it will turn everything upside down. I'll see you there.